It all began with the closing of the Walmart. The Walmart was not the catalyst for the death of Edan, but it was the final death throes of a dying town. Edan had never been what you would call a bustling city. With a population that topped out at about 75,000 in the mid-80s, the city had undoubtedly seen its heyday. The coal mine had finally panned out in '95. The calculator factory had likewise played out in 2002. The paper mill had lasted a while longer, shutting its doors in 2016. That had been the end of the major industry in Edan. The town had continued, of course. The downtown had done a fair bit of business with the summer people who came through. People from out of town always wanted to pick up a summer house or move to the outskirts to get away from it all. Despite the small spikes, the industry was going, and a lot of the people left when the paper mill closed down. Those who remained were the sort of people who couldn't have been blown out with dynamite. They were oldsters who had been there since they came back from World War II or Vietnam, dyed-in-the-wool capitalists who continued trying to bring industry to the area, and real estate people hoping to get one more dollar out of the dying town. Even some of those latter had to take a firm look at what they were trying to sell when the one seemingly solid job market finally closed up shop. The people of Edan didn't seem to mind, though. Quite the contrary. They were glad the last corporate giant was gone from the area. They talked longingly about getting back to the good old days and how this would help the waning business on Main Street to thrive again, without big corporations keeping their boot on the throat of the little man. Greg did not agree. For one, he'd been working at the Walmart since he got back from college in 2009. It had been keeping food on the table and the lights on in the dingy apartment that he'd been renting over Abigail's drugs for the better part of a decade, and that's how he liked it. They got the majority of his paychecks, too, and they might as well have been a company store the way Greg looked at it. Even so, it was convenient to have everything within easy reach. The second thing was harder to quantify, but was something that the philosophy teachers at the hoity-toity college he'd dropped out of would have understood all too well. Corporate giant or not, Walmart did not pull out of a thriving town that they could still make money in, as a rule. Watching the semi-trucks with the Walmart logos on them drive for the outskirts of town was like watching the axe-wielding vehicles drive out of the remains of the forest at the end of the Lorax book his mother had read to him as a kid. They had sucked the land dry like a vampire, and now it was time to get out while the getting was good. "Decided where you're going to go work now?" Patty asked, coming up on Greg's side and startling him. I don't know," Greg said morosely. "Abby's been trying to get me to work at the drugstore since Rachel went to college, but she just doesn't pay enough for me to live and eat." "Well, since she's your landlady, maybe she'll give you a little discount if you work for her." Greg laughed at that. The thought of Abigail Worthy giving her own grandmother so much as a nickel off her rent was a laughable prospect. That old biddy would probably haggle with the undertaker when it came time to put her in the ground, and then lodge a complaint for me on the grave when he put too little dirt on top of her coffin. He and Patty chatted for a little bit, making small talk as they watched the town disperse in the now empty parking lot of the supercenter. As the crowd thinned out, Greg stuck his hands in his pockets and told Patty he'd see her around. He walked away from the Walmart, his car having long ago been sold due to lack of use. When you never left town, what good was a car? He'd come back from college a month before his dad died, and had still been there a year after when his mom had told him that she was going to live in Florida with his aunt. He'd moved into the studio apartment over Abigail's, and sold his car the same year. The little hatchback had been great when he'd been putzing around Burbank, but now that everything was in walking distance, it seemed as useless as tits on a boar. He'd gotten about $5,000 for it, and coasted a little until he got the job at Walmart. He'd been working there for the past 10 years, it seemed, stocking shelves and answering questions for customers. You would think that after a decade, management would have cut him a check for his retirement, but Greg had never really paid in. He always said he was gonna every year when the papers came around, but he just never got around to it. It always seemed that when you lived in Edan, you did things tomorrow instead of today. It seemed that when you lived in Eden, you always thought there would be more time.
Stand up straight, Gregory. I'm not paying you to slouch.
Greg sat up and stopped leaning on the glass cabinet that was full of blood testers and diabetes equipment. He'd been working at the drugstore for about 2 months, and he hated every minute of it. To his surprise, Abigail had indeed offered him a discount on rent, but only if he would work for the 14 hours a day that the shop was open. So, from 5 a.m. to 7 p.m., closed on Sundays, Greg stood behind the counter and helped old ladies pick out constipation medication or helped old gents find exactly the right size of Depends for their bony asses. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid his rent and kept a bit of food on the table. Aside from selling drugstore things, the widow Abigail also sold a little bit of gas station food that was just affordable enough for Greg to avoid malnutrition. He had asked her once about an employee discount, and it was the hardest he had ever seen the old biddy laugh in her life. When the bell rang over the door, Greg looked up and smiled when he saw Patty coming in. Patty had been coming by the drugstore more and more often now that she knew Greg worked there, and she was a nice distraction from the monotony of his job. She had gotten a job down at the Quick Lube on Main Street, and it seemed that her hands were always caked in grease no matter how many times she washed them, her nail beds oily with the sweat of her labor. Abby glowered at the young woman as she came in, but she wasn't about to turn away a customer, even if most of her fare was to come and flirt with their only employee. Greg was not unaware of Patty's flirtation, but she really wasn't his type. Not that Greg had any right to be picky. He liked her all right, she was a good friend, but the thought of laying in bed with her in the way he had lain with some of the girls that he'd gone to college with made his skin crawl. His mother had always said, "Don't take anyone to bed in Eden, 'cause you're likely related to them," and he supposed it was something that had always resonated with him. "Did you get any of that lava soap I ordered?" Patty asked, and Greg reached under the counter and pulled out a brown bag with 3 bars of the funky orange soap inside. "I gave you the buy 2, get 1 free discount," Greg stage whispered, as he cast a suspicious eye over to the widow. "So generous," Patty said, pretending to blush. "Let me make it up to you after work and take you out for a slice of pizza." "Can't," Greg said somberly. "I'm doing inventory tonight. I'll probably be here till after midnight." Patty looked disappointed, but rebounded quickly. "Some other time, then?" "For sure," Greg said, and Patty paid for her soap and left with a little wave over her shoulder. "I don't know why you keep stringing that girl along, Gregory," Abby said as the door closed behind her. "She's the best thing you're likely to find in a dying town like Eden anyway," setting the barb like she always did. "My mom always said never take anyone to bed from Eden," Gregory said as the widow swept her way around the aisles, "because there was a pretty good chance you were related." "I'm not sure anyone in town would reproduce if they took your mother's maxim to heart," the widow said solemnly, going into the back to do some other sort of busy work. Greg let slip some of the words that his mother or the widow would have swatted him for if they'd been within earshot. He'd been going to Gino's to get his usual BLT and tomato soup, and the chicken noodle soup that the widow loved so much, for the last 2 months, and it had become a part of his daily routine. Miss Abigail had become fond of the soup since taking to her bed, and she didn't seem to complain as much when she had a bowl of it to hand. She'd been sick for about 2 months, and the doctor seemed to think that she might be for the rest of her life. It wasn't cancer or any of those trendy diseases that usually killed people. Nothing so grand as all that. The widow was suffering from regular old pneumonia, and it seemed like it was there to stay. He had come down to Gino's to get their lunch, only to find a close sign on the door, and the windows dark and uninviting. "They left town last night," said a familiar voice, and Greg jumped as Patty startled him again. "He was just open yesterday," Greg complained. "The least he could have done was told somebody." Patty laughed at that. "Greg, I think you were the only one in town that didn't know that Gino's was closing. He was serving you, me, and your boss, and that was it. Everyone else is either too broke to eat there or already gone." Greg looked around and seemed to notice that Main Street was looking a little emptier than it usually did. There were more empty businesses than open ones these days, something that had started happening about the time the Walmart closed a year and a half ago. People had expected it to breathe new life into the town, but really it just stopped a lot of summer people from coming at all, and led to a lot of the businessmen that had been planning things in Eden to pull up stakes and leave town too. Greg could see people milling about as they went between shops, but they were like heat illusions as they moved listlessly between the few open places and the restaurants. "How many people do you think are left in town?" he asked Patty on a whim. "I'd say less than 5,000. Daryl's talking about closing up the grease pit and moving it to Perkins with his mother." Greg was shocked. He's operated that garage ever since he came back from the Gulf War. Yeah, and most of the guys who came to him to get their cars worked on or their oils changed were in the Gulf War with him, too. Most of them are dead, left town, or the government took their driver's license, and they can't drive anymore. "What will you do?" Greg asked suddenly, a little bit nervously. He was aware that Patty still had romantic intentions for him, and even though he didn't want to date her, he certainly didn't want to lose what was likely his only friend. "You think Abigail would hire me? I hear she's got a real slouch working for her right now." "Ha ha," Greg said sarcastically. "She might, but certainly not for anything you could pay your rent with. She hasn't been doing too well lately. I think..." He looked uneasily back at Gino's before finding the words to properly express what he was thinking. "I think she might be dying, Patty." "You could be so lucky. They say she came over in the wagons when they first settled this place. The widow Abby is tougher than a boiled owl, and she'll probably outlive all of us." As Greg looked at the empty diner, he certainly hoped so. But in Eden, it often felt like you could shit in one hand and hope in the other, and see which one filled up quicker. "Gregory," the widow said as Greg blundered by on his way to the drugstore, "come in for a minute. We need to talk." Greg sighed as he turned to walk into her bedroom. This sounded like a "hey, I'm firing you" speech waiting to happen. Greg didn't understand how she could. He was her only employee. He basically operated the store by himself. If she fired him, there was no way she could get out of bed and man the shop by herself. She'd been living with the pneumonia for the last 5 months, and every day that dawned with Gregory hearing her watery cough was another day he knew he wouldn't have to call the coroner to come get her. As he pushed the door to her room open, he grabbed one of the masks from beside the door. He wasn't worried about catching anything from her, but what he might pass on to the frail old woman. The whole room smelled of sick, the sweaty aroma of a body too tired to take regular baths, the smell of old food that hadn't been removed, the stench from her bedpan that he would have to take with him when he left, and the wet smell of phlegm that she constantly hacked into a napkin. She breathed heavily, like someone whose lungs are full of lake water, and she smiled sardonically when she saw Greg. "You aren't quite as handsome as the young man I always pictured coming to take care of me after I outlived my husband, but I'm still glad to have you, Gregory." He smiled as he took her hand, holding it gently. "If you're well enough to be sarcastic, then I could really use your help downstairs," he said, enjoying their daily fencing matches. "I'm afraid there won't be anything to open for much longer, son. I just don't have the strength to go down those stairs anymore, and I fear it won't be long before I go to meet my first husband again." She coughed wetly into a napkin as she spoke, and Greg had the good manners not to snatch away his hand. "It sounds an awful lot like you're firing me," Greg said gently. "I suppose I am," she said, "but gently, I hope." "If you're firing me, it might be hard for me to pay you rent, and then I'm not sure how you'd pay the taxes on this place." "That could be difficult," she amended, "but so is coming after a corpse for debt." "How about this?" Greg said. "I'll run the drugstore and manage the accounts so you can keep paying for your medicine if you let me live here and take care of you. Then, when you're gone, you can fire me. How about that?" She laughed, the sound coming out fractured like ice on the cusp of breaking. "You? How could you possibly run the shop and balance the books and order enough product to keep up with the clientele?" "Well, I've been doing a pretty good job for the last 9 months, so I figure I'll just keep doing it until..." He stopped himself from saying it, realizing he'd become fond of the old woman and the time he'd been taking care of her. "Until you get better." She chuckled wetly, sounding like a frog, and looked up at him with her big wet eyes. "You're a good man, Gregory Boyle, no matter what your mother always said about you." "Keep talking like that," he said, rising up as the sun began to cresp the little window, "and I'll make you come downstairs and do some work." "Thanks, come again." The old man smiled toothlessly at Patty as she showed him out. She'd agreed to work at the drugstore after her parents had left their house to her. It's only until they sell it, but they said it was nice to have someone looking after it. Greg had agreed that it sounded pretty cool, but he doubted her parents would ever manage to sell the place. The last realtor had left town 6 months ago, and no one new had bought so much as a cup of dirt from Edan since then. There had been some excitement when a company had purchased the old paper mill, but they had all come in with their trucks and stripped what they could from the factory before leaving. As far as Gregory knew, they had never been back. "You're pretty good at being a checkout girl," Gregory said, grinning as Patty snorted at him. "It's not like it's hard. Most of this stuff sells itself." There was a loud cough from the stairs, and Gregory turned to see Abby making her way slowly down them. She'd been feeling stronger lately, and Gregory had often found her stuck halfway down the stairs. He came to help her, chiding her as she sucked in air soupily. "You're gonna kill yourself like that. You're a little stronger, but don't push it."
"Nonsense," she rasped. "This girl needs proper training. With you to teach her, she'll develop all sorts of bad habits."
"I've got it, Miss Abby. Patty's no slouch. She knows how to do customer service." "It was basically all I did in the automotive department of Walmart," Patty added. The widow scoffed.
"That place wouldn't know customer service if it bit 'em."
But she began to cough more as she elaborated, and Greg had to hold her up as it racked her body. "Come on, let's get you to the rocker out front. You can greet the customers as they come in and maybe get a little sun. I don't want them to think I've got the Halloween decorations out early." She started to protest, but the sun really had done wonders. The doctors had expected her to succumb to her illness months ago, but it was coming up on 2 years and she was still puttering along. He wrapped her in a blanket and sat her in one of the rocking chairs that dotted the front area. She shivered amidst her layers, the slight breeze reminding Gregory that fall was almost here. He had just gotten her settled when an older woman in a thick shawl approached the shop. "Good morning, Miss Laurie. What brings you here today?" The old woman gave him a wave.
"Just came to get the last of my prescriptions to take to Heavenly View. I'm moving at the end of the week, and they want a list for their physician." "I'll get it for you," Abby rasped, but Greg told her to sit as he went back inside to get the envelope. Losing Miss Laurie to the nursing home would be quite a blow to their business, but Greg had been expecting it. After her husband died, Miss Laurie became a shut-in. She only left the house to see her doctor or fill her prescription, and this was the first time they'd seen her in weeks. As Greg came back with the envelope, he caught the tail end of their conversation. "I'm sure they have room for you, Miss Abby. You could relax with the time you have left and not have to struggle so much. There are people there to help you, and I'm sure Gregory could watch your shop for you." "It sounds awfully nice," Abby said softly, "but I just don't think I can leave Gregory on his own. He depends so much on my wisdom."
Miss Laurie took the envelope, wishing Abby and Gregory the best as she made her way home. The streets were a little less empty today, but the people taking in the sights were nothing but bored locals trying to kill some time. The cars leaving town became fewer and fewer, but that was due in part to the number of residents becoming less and less as well. Greg saw less than a dozen people on a daily basis now, and as the oldsters he'd taken for granted went to either Heavenly View or their heavenly home, their business suffered. Greg watched her go, seeing the potential end of her business as the beginning of the end. Greg flopped onto the rocker in front of the drugstore, his breath coming in deep, grateful lungfuls. All around him, chaos reigned, but its conquest was coming to an end. The fire trucks had taken longer than expected to arrive, Edan's own fire department being little more than 2 volunteers these days. They had both been at home when the fire started, and they had arrived only a little before the trucks from Perkins. It could have been a lot worse. Would have been, in fact, if Greg hadn't smelled the smoke and called for help. As it stood, only 6 buildings had been burned out, their gutted husks looking forlorn in the blinking lights of the fire trucks. Another 4 were damaged, but all 10 had been empty, except for the hardware store. Greg could see Gabriel sobbing quietly on the porch of his father's legacy, the rustic old shop now a burnt cinder that would never rise again. Greg wanted to go to him, especially after all the work he'd done to keep the rest of Main Street from burning, but he was too bone-weary to do much else but sit and be glad that he wasn't crying over a burnt husk too. It had all started at the old ice cream parlor. The building had been abandoned for years, closing up shop right around the same time the Walmart had. That had given the rats that now occupied the space plenty of time to chew on the wires and ruin the electrical box. Greg couldn't prove that that's what had started the fire, but when the smoke woke him up, the peeling white exterior was in full blaze. He'd called the fire department and been redirected to the station in Perkins. As he came out onto the porch, Gabriel was already using one of the big wrenches to pry open the fire hydrant. "Help me!" he gasped through gritted teeth, and as Greg took hold of the wrench, the two had water shooting out in no time. They had just managed to smother the worst of the fire at the parlor when the empty store beside it blazed to life. The next hour became a series of tossing water onto smoldering buildings, only to see the one next to it go up in flames. The old buildings were just so dry, and the summer had been a hot one. The wooden storefronts were little more than kindling to the hungry flames, and even some of the brick fronts began to smoke as their windows shattered from the heat. The trucks showed up, after the 2 men had been joined by a pair from the gas station down the road, Greg having played firefighter for half an hour by that point. The firefighters looked miffed that the 2 had opened a hydrant, but they hooked up anyway, and seemed better equipped at dousing the remains of their once beautiful Main Street. As the trucks rolled away, Greg squinted at the first light of dawn as it crested the broken pavement. He staggered inside, reaching to turn the sign around before realizing the futility. There would be no business today, not with all the smoldering buildings on the street. "Abby, I don't think we're opening up shop today. I'm bone weary, and debris is going to make it impossible to get up the street." He expected her to rasp at him. She was always up early, but he heard nothing. He moved closer to the door, knocking on it, but he still received no answer. He knocked again before pushing inside, seeing her buried beneath her blankets like a small bear. She looked so peaceful, her usual ragged breathing sounding much better today. She usually coughed every 4th breath, but he hadn't heard her cough at all since he'd come in. "Come on, don't be mad. It's been a really long night and I'm dog-tired. There's no way anyone's going to..." As he got close, he noticed that her breathing wasn't clearer like he'd thought. He'd been so tired that he'd overlooked her lack of coughing and wheezing, thinking she might have finally gotten better. It seemed he was right, as was her doctor. He had said that she would keep the pneumonia for the rest of her life. It appeared that now she was cured of it. She neither wheezed nor rasped, coughed or railed. She lay as peaceful as she had when she was a girl. Her breathing wasn't clearer because she was better. Her breathing was clearer because she wasn't breathing. Greg didn't sleep at all that day, and the trucks from Perry had barely passed the county line. When he called for an ambulance, he knew would arrive much too late. There were only 10 attendees at Abby Worth's funeral. Greg, Patty, and Mayor Daniel were the only 3 from town, the rest being friends from outside Eden. Abby had a simple service. Her plot in Mount Pleasant was arranged the same year her husband had died. She was laid to rest beside him, and when the mayor agreed to follow Greg and Patty back to the apartment, they were flattered to have him join them for dinner. "You know, she left it all to you," the mayor said, making appreciative noises as he ate the meatloaf Patty had made. Greg almost choked as he looked at the man. "How do you know that?" "I'm the only notary and lawyer in town. She came to me after she got sick and told me she was leaving it all to you. She didn't have any other family. Did you know that? Nomad, I guess. You and Patty here are 2 of about 90 residents left in Eden." That took Greg by surprise. How are there so few? Fire last week made the remaining businesses on Main Street rethink staying. They see the unoccupied buildings as a liability,
Most of them sold their shops and moved to Perry or DeCroix. The outliers will be gone at the end of the year. None of them have signed leases for the next year, and by January this place may be the only business in town." The three sat eating in silence for a few minutes, letting it all sink in. It seemed that Edan, too, was gasping out its last. "I figure the Jim brothers at Jim Petrol will sign up for another year, but I doubt I'll be here to see them close up shop next year. My term ends in May, and whether nepotism elects me mayor again or not, I'm leaving for Montana. My mother's properties sat empty for too many years, and I think I might be ready to retire to the mountains." He excused himself after that, thanking Patty for the meatloaf as he left the two of them in the little apartment. The two ate in silence, their grief palpable as they quietly mourned a woman they had both grown close to. "Did I tell you?" Patty finally said, looking up from her laborious task of herding her green beans into a corner. "Someone finally bought Mom and Dad's old house." "Oh?" Greg asked, his mind trying to punch through the film of grief to realize what this meant. Who's the lucky owner?" "State Road Department," she said, managing a small, painful smile. "They bought most of the houses in that area. They're starting work on a highway project that will cut the time from Washington to California by hours. It's bad news for Perry. It'll cut a lot of the little roads out of the equation and give them a straight shot to the coast." What she didn't say was this would also be a huge detriment to Edan, but that hardly seemed to matter. Where will you go?" Greg asked, his food forgotten at the prospect of being one less in a town of ghosts. "I don't know," she said. She was standing at the sink, and Greg could see her in profile. She looked lovely in mourning, a woman that any man would have been lucky to have the love of. She was dependable, she was hard-working, she was kind, and, worst of all, she seemed to put her own happiness aside for Greg. He knew she would give him that love, that she would stay with him in this tiny apartment if he asked her to, but he also knew that it would be selfish to ask. In the movies, Greg would ask her to stay, and they would embrace and kiss, and soon their children would be running through the streets as they watched happily from rockers on the front porch. She seemed to be waiting for just that, but Greg couldn't give it to her. She deserved more than Greg's empty companionship. Patty deserved something more than Greg's fumbling platonic feelings. She told him good night a few minutes later, taking her Pyrex dish and leaving through the familiar stairs. Even in his grief, now elevated by the loss of his friend, Greg wasn't blind to the sobs she tried to muffle. Greg came awake like a hibernating bear, the loud banging on the door enough to wake the dead. Someone was really walloping it, too, slamming their fist against it hard enough to rattle the glass, and Greg came tentatively out of bed. He was wearing only a shirt and jockey shorts, his mid-30s belly hanging over the waistband as he crept from the bedroom and into the living room. He reached for the fire poker as he came, afraid that the empty town might have attracted teenagers bent on helling. They would have seen the lights in the bathroom upstairs and decided to shake the cages a little, and Greg wished he'd thought to grab his shotgun before leaving the bedroom. He came down the stairs in a slow, jerky walk, the pounding not stopping in the least bit. Whoever it was calling his name, too, which was a little off-putting. Greg couldn't imagine anyone he knew in this town being out so late and banging on his door, but he quickened his pace a little, fearing someone was in trouble. Maybe Patty was hurt. Maybe there'd been another fire. Maybe it was something even worse. He'd been right about that, it seemed, and as the door came open, he found Patty leaning against the frame, grinning at him drunkenly. "There you are, Gregory," she trumpeted, stumbling into him as she slurred an apology. "Are you all right?" Greg asked, trying not to draw attention to her current state, but finding it very difficult. "Right with Eversharp," she said, her hands wrapping around him as she tried to pull him into her arms. "What's gotten into you, Patty?" Greg asked, though it was pretty clear what had gotten into her. As if in response, Patty pressed her lips against his, silencing his upcoming protests. Her tongue was warm and wet as it tried to invade his mouth, and Greg struggled as he tried to push her away. His skin was covered in goosebumps, and he was shuddering as she leaned closer to him. He could taste the alcohol on her breath, and it was making him gag.
He didn't know what she'd been drinking, but it was stronger than anything he was familiar with. When she finally pulled away from him, her eyes were streaming tears, and they looked hurt and confused. "Why won't you kiss me back?" she wailed, as she stumbled backwards and bumped into the doorframe. Greg searched for the words, but he just couldn't find them. I just don't think of you that way," he finally blurted out. She sobbed, her eyes gushing as she looked at him blearily. She was drunk and confused, and clearly this had made more sense before she'd come to his home in the middle of the night. Now her hopes were falling to pieces, and she was left with nothing but the understanding that she was alone. He'd been honest with her, but that had hardly cut the sting. "Why won't you love me?" she bawled, her eyes accusatory even as they gushed tears. "I stayed in this corpse of a town for you, Greg. I worked at a place that barely paid for my groceries and lied to my parents when they wanted nothing but to send me back to college. And for what? I love you, Greg. I've loved you since we were kids. Why won't you love me back?" When he gripped her shoulder, it sobered her a little, and he saw the embarrassment starting to creep into her eyes. "I do love you, Patty. I love you too much to let you settle for someone who doesn't love you the same way you love them. You deserve someone who will love you as deeply as you love me, and I can't do that. Go. Let your parents send you to college. Live the life you deserve. Find someone who will care for you the way you care for me." It was morning before she sobered up enough to leave, and the two had a long talk. Patty cried a lot, Greg finding his eyes too dry for tears. She didn't sway as she left, the alcohol having been burned away by her despair. Greg watched her go, and went to bed as the sun filled the apartment with light. Tomorrow would be Sunday, the only day Abby let them close the store. He'd take tomorrow to mourn, and then open the store on Monday. It seemed appropriate somehow to take a day for himself before getting back to the only thing he was good at. Greg sat on the front porch of Abby's drugs, the snow coming down as it coated the cracked and pitted streets of Eden. It had been 20 years since the widow Abby Worth had passed, and he was still living in Eden, if you could call it living. His hair was now the silver of falling snow, his eyes not as good as they had been, and his legs shook a little when he walked. That didn't stop him from tending the garden that he'd begun growing on 5th Street, or the other on 6th Street, that had borne corn every year since Patty had left. He had a letter from her somewhere upstairs, in the drawer where he kept his prized possessions. She had sent a few others, a wedding invitation, a birth announcement, and a few Christmas cards, but he hadn't received anything from her in 4 years. She would be old too now, and Greg wondered if she might have died. He coughed as he watched the snow, bending double into the rocker as he spat phlegm into it. It sounded as bad as the widow's had, and he didn't need a doctor to tell him that he was dying. It had started as a cough, just a dry thing that was better some days than others, but it had grown wet and rough, and now his breathing was soupy and worrisome. He supposed it would probably kill him, and he found that the idea didn't bother him all that much. He could feel the cold weight of the gold key he wore around his neck, and he smiled as he thought of the day Mayor Daniel had come to say goodbye. He had lasted longer in the town than he'd thought, outlasting the Jim brothers by a whole month. Their contract with Exxon had been canceled when they couldn't pay their gas bill, and without the gas, they had packed up shop and headed to parts unknown. By then, there had been about 60 people on the outskirts, and no one in the town proper. Days would go by between people sightings, but there were still a few who came to the drugstore. It wasn't until the outlying farms and lands began being annexed by the surrounding towns that Mayor Daniels had decided to leave. Greg had looked up when the bell rang and nodded when he saw Daniels walk in. "Something ailing you, Mayor?" he asked, but the graying man had shaken his head. "Not the mayor anymore. I'm heading out, I think. I'm not sure where, but I think Eden is all but played out." He tossed the key to Greg then, the one that would open most any door or any building or storefront that was still good, the mayor's office, the sheriff's office, anything else the town deemed the mayor worthy of guarding. Guess now you're the mayor, the last mayor of Eden. Wear the title with pride. If you leave, be sure to pass the key to whoever's still here. Greg had never gotten a letter from him, but the key had come in handy when it came to planting and keeping the power on. It also got him a small stipend from the state, which he used to keep the lights on Main Street burning, and some food in his fridge to keep him from starving. Greg hadn't seen anyone wander through Eden in years, save for a few cars that got lost on their way somewhere else. Sometimes ghost hunters or the curious came to visit, and Greg told them what town history he remembered as he tried to ignore their petty theft. They never took much. Anything worth anything was locked away behind one of those doors that his key opened. He supposed they would have it after he was gone, if they didn't mind a little grave robbing or corpse rifling. He coughed then, and when he took his hand away, his palms had red on them. As he looked down Main Street, he could see the collapsed remains of the old Walmart as it hunkered like a tired dog. He remembered standing outside it as he watched the trucks roll away, and it seemed like 1,000,000 years had passed since then. People called Eden a ghost town, and they weren't wrong. As Greg looked up and down the street, he imagined all the ghosts who must reside here. He watched a gaggle of old ladies wandering up the road towards the Baptist church that had burned to the ground 3 years ago during a lightning storm. He saw some school kids laughing up the road as they headed for the ice cream parlor that had started the fire all those years ago. He saw 4th of July parades, Christmas tree lightings in the square, summer days that ended with the sound of cicadas, scarecrow contests that the mayor had resided over dutifully. Greg thought he saw Patty and Abby waiting for him, and as the rise and fall of his chest slowed, he wondered if he might love her in the hereafter, as he never could in life. As he watched the snow come down around him, and the swish of his chair became slower and slower, he supposed he would find out. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. If you think you might be able to handle just one more creepy tale, go ahead and click on one of the stories you can doubtlessly see appearing at the end of this one. If you're not subscribed, go ahead and hit that subscribe button too. Maybe hit that bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If, like so many of my patrons, you decide you'd like to get your spooky a little bit earlier, why not come on down to Patreon and have a look at some of the great tiers that I have. My $5 tiers get their spooky a little early, and they have their name read out at the end of every TikTok and every YouTube video that I make. If you'd like a copy of my latest book, there's a link below to my Amazon profile. I've got many books. I'm sure you'll find one that'll suit you there. I always recommend Stragview Stories, as it's the one I'm the most proud of. It contains a large collection of prison horror stories out of Stragview, the prison that I've made in the Georgia Hills. So, if you'd like to have a look, come on down. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our patrons. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being my Ghostly Reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.